Okay. I think hopefully the audio's. All right. I'm gonna talk to you today and show you how to successfully take your subject and break it down into low poly. You're gonna want to have this sheet with all this weird stuff on it. You're gonna want to have a piece of tracing paper and a writing utensil. I like to use a Sharpie, that way I can see what I am drawing. And then you're also going to need a light table. To get the light table to work, it has to be plugged in. The smaller end of the cord will go into the light table right next to the power button. Make sure you're looking into that area before you just shove the cord in here because it does go in a certain way. The other end of the cord, it's a little bit wider, is the USB. That you're actually going to plug in to the computer, the box, okay? The big black box next to your computer screen is the computer. And you should see USB inputs there. Okay. To get this to turn on, there's one button on it. It's the power button. There we go. When you click it, it should light up. If it's too bright or too dark, if you hold the power button, it will brighten it or dark it. I'm actually going to make mine a little bit darker. A little bit darker. That should be good. Okay. Once you turn on your light table, you're going to want to put this paper on top. And then on top of that, you want to place that tracing paper. Okay. I'm going to write the three main steps of low poly here. Usually you want to do them in order. Today I'm going to kind of go out of order. We're really going to focus on form first and then kind of go back and talk about some of those other steps. Step one is usually we want to look for main shapes. Main shapes. Step two, we're going to look at the form. And step three, we are going to break it up into some triangles. So main shapes, form, triangles. We are going to start with this sphere up here. I ever so kindly gave you a sphere that already has some guidelines on it just for a quick practice. Notice I have the words too many written up here. Never, ever, ever do I want you to break up your subject, the shapes, into this many sections, okay? This is way too advanced. We're gonna do less than that. All right. Starting with step one, we need to grab main shapes. This is a very simple subject, just a sphere. So the only main shape we really need to grab is the outside of the sphere. So we're gonna just grab it as a circle here. When we are looking at this, we don't want to draw just a bunch of straight lines on it because we're going to lose the form. We want to make it look like this is rounded. So notice the lines on here are curved, they're not straight. So I want you to take your writing utensil and just follow some of those lines with your marker or whatever you're using. And already you can see it's starting to look like it's a rounded object. And you can see on this that they have form guidelines going both up and down vertically and side to side horizontally. We always want to include both. That way we are making a couple smaller sections here. And if I pull this paper away, it's already starting to look like a rounded sphere, right? So that was just a quick little practice here. Now we're gonna move on to some of these harder subjects. We're gonna go to the blue sphere or the blue ball. Same thing, we're gonna grab main shapes. Again, it's a very simple subject. So the only thing I really need to grab is the outside of that ball. And when I start laying my form guidelines, remember, we don't want to include too many, but we don't want to include too few. I usually start in the middle and then build outside of that or work around it. Doesn't really matter if you start in the middle or not. I just like to kind of balance out my form guidelines. So we're gonna lay one in the middle. Remember, it should not be straight because this is a sphere. So we want it to have a little bit of a curve to it, just like we did over here. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of curve it. And then I'm looking at these empty edges here, thinking, could I add another vertical form guideline? Yes, okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and take my marker and start to add another super curved guideline. Maybe one more on the other edge here. And it's okay to exaggerate the curve. From here, I feel like that's good enough for the vertical guidelines. We have pretty even good sections to work with. I don't want to break it up into too many itty bitty sections. I do, however, want to add some horizontal guidelines. So I'm going to start in the middle again, curving it. It's kind of starting to look like a basketball. And then I'm going to add one more on the top and the bottom. And I can really exaggerate the curve here. And I can curve it up if I wanted to as well. Still bending in that direction. So again, we're really starting to see the form take shape here. We're making that look like it's gonna curve. From here, I want us to stop using not straight lines. So remember, polygons have straight sides, and we at least have to have 3 edges to make a polygon. So we're gonna go back through and straighten some of these sides out. I'm just gonna take my Sharpie, try to make all of my lines here look a little bit straighter. When we get on Illustrator, we will be using what's called the pen tool. It's gonna force you to use straight sides to make that shape, to make your subject. Just quickly going through here, straighten some of these up. And it's gonna start to make it look a little bit blockier, a little bit chunkier, kind of like a video game, or kind of like a disco ball, right? This is good. This is what we are trying to get to, okay? Um, for now, I'm not gonna go ahead and do triangles. I want to focus mainly on big main shapes and form until we get the hang of that, and then we'll move on. So this is good for main shapes and form. Check and check. Um, we are going to move down to this little yellow cube, ice cube, jello thing. Again, we're going to start with main shapes. We have not just one giant shape here. It's kind of broken into 3 faces. So I'm going to go ahead and grab each face. And I'm only using straight lines because I have to end up making polygons here. So I'm sectioning off each face as a main shape. From here, we're going to go ahead and move on to form. Whether or not you knew it, up here when we were making the form of our sphere, we were kind of using the edge of this shape as a guideline to how our form lines should be. So looking at just the top section here, can you see that? of my cube, I can actually use the edges of it to guide me in making my form guidelines. So I know that the top of this is probably pretty smooth. It's pretty flat. So I don't need to worry about trying to make anything look like it's bumped up or rounded. Looking at these two sides here, I know that I want to move my eyes back along this cube. So I'm going to steal from those lines and simply just draw one starting in the middle, just like I did up here, starting in the middle for my form guideline. I could break up these sections a little bit more and draw another form guideline heading back away from us, but it's still flat on either side of that. And then just like we did up here, we have a couple lines running in one direction. We want to have a couple running in the opposite direction to kind of split those sections. So I'm looking at these two sides now. I'm going to use it to kind of guide my next form guidelines. And I can see that it's pulling my eye in both of these directions, but it's also still feeling like it's somewhat flat. We can accomplish the same thing on the left and right face of our cube. We're looking again at any lines that we can use to kind of help us out with what type of form guideline we should make. Again, we know that this face is probably flat, but it's at an angle and it's heading back away from us. So I can use the top and bottom lines here to help guide my eye in that form back away from this front edge. And again, if I needed to, I could add two more around it, but I'm just going to stay with the one. And then again, I need to add one going in the opposite direction. So I'm looking at the sides here. I'm going to draw one right in the middle that kind of guides my eye up and shows me that this side is flat, similar to this corner. And we can go ahead and reflect that on the other side here. So just from these few couple lines, we can tell that the top of this is flat, but the sides look like they're standing up, right? Which is exactly what we want. We're gonna move on to something a little bit harder. Remember, we're not doing triangles yet, so we're gonna leave this as is. We're gonna come up here to the cone. We're starting with main shapes, and we're using all straight flat lines. I'm gonna grab the top of my cone here as a triangle. I'm gonna grab the base of my cone here as a somewhat square. Whoa. What it's starting to look like. And I'm going to grab this circle or oval, but remember, we're using straight lines. So I'm gonna kind of go in and chunk out close to that circle shape as I can using straight lines. Last thing that we're gonna start thinking about here more and more, for main shapes, we also want to think about big shifts in color. For example, the top part of my cone here has orange, white, orange, white, orange. If I was going to low poly this and I had a triangle right here in the middle, half of it's on the orange, half of it's on the white. What color do I fill that in? Should I fill it in orange or should I fill it in white? We don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're splitting those sections. That way our cone ends up looking like a cone. Okay. So I'm actually going to start splitting up really big color changes into their own main shapes. Remember that we are still using straight lines. So I'm kind of making these little jagged chevron lines to show the curve of that and the difference in the color. I think at this point, this is good for main shapes. And now we're going to start to think about form. Luckily for us, these stripes on our cone are actually wrapping around it. So we've already got some solid form guidelines with that color change. But we do want to add one or two going in horizontally here. So even though we have good vertical ones, I'm going to come in, just draw one cutting straight back through kind of the tip of those little chevrons. And I can use the edges here of the top of my cone to make a few more horizontal form guidelines. I'm slowly starting to angle them out to show that that's getting whiter as it's rounding. We're going to move to the inside of the cone here. If we were itty bitty tiny, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, we could actually go inside of this kind of like a tunnel, right? Bye, see ya. So we are going to use the edge of this cone here, kind of as a reference, just like we've been doing for the edges. And I am going to do my best to round out a form guideline using straight lines. It's kind of bad, but. And then I have quite a bit of space still left in here, so I'm going to add at least one more, trying to make it appear pretty rounded. Boom. And then as always, we want to add in form guidelines going in the opposite direction. Since this is going inside that cone, I'm going to add a couple that connect those little corner pieces heading into my cone, kind of like that. It's almost like a vortex, right? Because I'm heading into that. Same thing here. All straight lines. And I could add one in the center if I really wanted to. Boom. So now we can really see that, yep, we can head into the inside of it and it's rounded, and the outside here is rounded, and it's kind of heading back in this direction. The last section we have to deal with is the base. The base of the cone hopefully should kind of remind you of our cube over here. Instead of drawing a line all the way across the space though, we don't want it to cut through our circle section because that is heading into the cone. It's not flat, right? So when I use the sides of this to kind of guide and inform me to make those forms, I'm just going to make little baby guidelines. I have one heading vertically and one heading horizontally. Just little baby guidelines. Okay. Also, whatever subject you end up choosing, sometimes there are little hints and giveaways to help you make good form guidelines. For example, the corners here, my cone, have little lines that head in towards the center of that cone. Those would be perfectly fine to add in because they're still flat, but they're also pulling our eye in towards that kind of inside tunnel area. This is really, really good for main shapes and form. We're not doing triangles there yet, okay? So not too bad. We're working with some basic shapes here, basic forms, thinking about how they look in real life. Now, what I want to do is I want to come back up to our sphere here. We talked about color shifts in our cone. So we have orange and whites up here. On my sphere, I do have a couple bigger color shifts, right? If we are looking, you can see that I have the highlight, sorry, the highlight here and a little baby highlight here, and it gets a little bit darker where that cast shadow's at. So if I was low polying this, I would want to split those things up. On here, I'm gonna go through and make lines that chop those sections up. So I'm grabbing that highlight and I want to grab my shadow. Kind of like that. So we're going to start to think more and more about grabbing main shapes and color changes. Same thing here. So we have highlight. You could grab this baby highlight if you wanted to. And then we have that cast shadow. Down here, there are lots of little color shifts. If this was really big, we would want to grab a lot. Mainly, I'm looking at the brightest of the bright areas and the darkest of the dark. And then again, if there's like a crazy drastic color change, of course, grab that. So in here, I might just grab these really dark areas, all with straight lines. And I would want those to be right up here. Ooh, main shapes. Same thing back here. We have some darker sections. I would want to grab as many of those as I could. That way, when I have to fill it in a color, I already have it kind of sectioned off. Okay. Pull this over here. Thinking about splitting sections into triangles. The best way to do it when we get to triangles is trying to work symmetrically. Remember, symmetrically is when we have almost a perfect reflection on either side. So if I was working with my cube down here, I could add a triangle here just by splitting that square in half. On the opposite side, I would want to reflect that up. And if I want to be really, really symmetrical, I could reflect this down and almost make a nice little star out of it. Same thing over here. Reflect these lines all the way through. And then, of course, I also have the main shapes split up. For my sphere, I could start with that center line, cut in half, and reflect my triangle over that center line. Reflect one down here, down here. It's gonna start to look more and more low poly. This one's rounded, of course, right? But you're starting to see what I mean when we're chopping it into triangles to reflect those areas. Down here, I could cut in half, cut in half, cut in half, cut in half. This is really nice and balanced. And then I could start to reflect some of these lines out. It's gonna look pretty symmetrical and we're gonna have good even weight. For my cone, let's look and see what other big color changes we have. The inside of it, it gets a little bit darker, but it ends up working out because I've already kind of sectioned off the darker section. So I have like a really dark area, medium orange area, bright orange area. So I think we're good there for main colors. For reflections on the cone, let's start on the outside here. I have that center line. I could start slicing triangles in half and reflecting them over that center line. Add some up here, down here. I'm just reflecting over my center line. And then from there, I'm just kind of doing whatever I feel like looks good. Still thinking about the symmetry. It does not have to be a perfect reflection. Okay, it does not have to be. Inside my cone, same thing. I kind of have a center line here. I could cut into triangle pieces. And then across the center line, I could reflect. And I could cut, reflect, cut, reflect. So what I do to one side, I'm trying to do to the other. Let's see. Cut, 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 cut. And I know right now it's starting to look crazier and crazier. But trust me, it's gonna look really good. You are allowed to leave, remember, only like 50 to 60% of it needs to be triangles. So I could leave this outside flat part of the cone as is. There's still polygons. Are they perfect triangles? No. Is everything inside of here a perfect triangle? No. As long as we're close, we're good. Okay. I know that's a lot of information to take in. We are going to look at the car here. And we are going to start with main shapes. When we are thinking about main shapes, remember we're looking at big sections of the car and then big color changes. To section the car off, I'm going to grab the hood. Kind of reminds me of the cube, right? It's pretty flat. I'm gonna grab my windshield. Gonna grab the top of my car. And I'm only using straight lines. Gonna grab the grill. Gonna grab this back window. Gonna grab the back portion of the car. The side of the car. Front section of the car. Here's what my car is starting to look like. When I get down to the wheels, I'm gonna grab a couple different sections. I'm gonna grab the front part of the wheel, but there's also kind of that back, or I guess front section of the tire that we can see. So I have the flat portion and that front curved portion of my tire. My car has lots of different main shapes. Not only thinking about the big chunks of my car, but also main color shifts. So in the window here, I have white to black. I'm gonna want to split that. In the grill, I have black to kind of that silver and white. On the front portion of my tire, I have black to silver. So I'm looking and look at this big black stripe here. If I want that, I'm gonna have to section that off. I'm gonna start splitting some of those up. I'm gonna split my window. I'm gonna split the different pieces of my grill here. I'm gonna split my tire. Remember, I'm still using all straight lines. I'm gonna grab that black stripe, still using straight lines. So here's what it's starting to look like, more and more like a car. Um, and if this was a bigger image, if this was my project, yes, absolutely, I would grab all other little small color changes that I wanted. But since this is a small image and it's just practice, I feel like we're pretty good on main shapes. Okay. Okay. From here, I'm going to start thinking about the form. Looking at this top section of my car, I know that it's flat, kind of at an angle. And again, just like we did with the cube here, I can use some of these lines to help guide me. Always start in the middle. And then if I need to add some around, I can. I always want to have some form guidelines going back in the opposite direction. Ooh, small area. Kind of starting to get that waffle effect. On my window or windshield here, the front one, I can tell that it's angled up just by looking at these sidelines here. So I'm going to add one that's angled up. And then using the top and bottom of that windshield, I can split it in half. The side window, I can tell that it's angling back because the top and bottom line. So I'm going to start to angle it back. This is tricky because we have two lines here that are kind of angled out. One's heading this direction and one is heading this direction. Remember the cone, the sides of it are heading out in opposite directions. So I could add a happy medium line in the middle that's not completely swaying one way or the other, and then start to swing my second line out a little bit more. The top of this, I can tell from my surrounding lines that it's flat but heading back away from us, but it's also heading back in this direction. And I'm gonna let you guys finish the rest of the car here in a moment. For the sections that I have split with you, triangles, remember, look at our center line and start reflecting, okay? Reflect, reflect. Boom, boom. And slowly but surely, it's starting to turn into low poly, okay? So I'm gonna have you guys go ahead and finish the rest of the car here. Excuse me. Adding in, woo, form guidelines and then breaking it into triangles.